So welcome, and throughout the afternoon, feel free as seats make themselves available on the table to come forward. This is Aspen, and we really like to encourage dialogue around the table. We don't want this to be too much of a formal panel type discussion. It's really meant to be an interaction among really everyone here. So thank you all for coming. My name is Jim Pickup. I am the General Counsel of the Aspen Institute, and conveniently, I also happen to be with the Middle East Investment Initiative, which we founded here at Aspen. And it's its own organization, but it is very tightly linked with a lot of things. And we can explain more exactly what Middle East Investment Initiative does, what Aspen does, but really I thought we would get our conversation started here. I'm going to introduce our two panelists who need very little introduction themselves. First, obviously, Secretary Albright is on the board of the Aspen Institute. She is chair of Albright Stone Ridge Group and chair of Albright Capital Management. You may know that she was the 64th Secretary of State and has a very long and distinguished history both working in and out of government. She is still currently a full professor at Georgetown University, which is an active teaching gig. So we are at her feet as students here as well. And then Ambassador Darroch just started here in Washington. I think you presented your papers in February, but also has a 30-year career in government, in the national security and diplomacy. Prior to his posting in Washington, Ambassador Darroch was the national security advisor to the Prime Minister from 2012, I think it was, till just September of this year. And before that, was the UK's top diplomat in Brussels, representing the UK there. So really, we have two guests here who could not be more well-informed about the issues at hand, and we're here really primarily to talk about the refugee crisis, about Syria. But I thought we may get things going. I think it'd be sort of remiss, given what happened in Brussels yesterday, and I think we often talk about tragedies that happen in Europe at a different volume, recognizing also that there were recent tragedies over the last week or two in Istanbul and elsewhere in the region. And we were talking about this before. There was a very good column this morning in the Washington Post by David Ignatius, and I read everything that David Ignatius says with great interest. But one of the things he talked about was the need for greater coordination, greater intelligence cooperation between Europe, UK obviously, and the United States. And I thought maybe as a jumping off point, we could talk a little bit about the critical nature of that, and then we'll get into our conversation about refugees, because they are linked. So maybe first, Madam Secretary, and then we can...
Terrific. Jim, thank you very much, and Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the Aspen Institute and the United States, in that order. Delighted to have you be here. I do think that there are an awful lot of things to talk about, but there is no question that what did happen in Brussels is something that reverberates in so many ways, actually into the subject of refugees, and I hope that we kind of focus on that in a way of there's not a lot of trust of refugees anyway, and that in fact has complicated the issue in some ways in terms of trying to figure out who is who, and then has in fact reverberated in this country. I was trying to explain to the ambassador what's going on in our political scene at the moment, a little harder than usual, but it has already picked up reverberations here in terms of sending, depending upon to whom you listen, in terms of having people monitor Muslim communities and do a number of completely un-American kind of activities. And I think we have to understand that. I do think that of the issues, what is important as this all becomes unpacked, is that there has not been, I think, the best intelligence sharing. And clearly, we, with our best friends, the Europeans, need to figure out some kind of a system where we are able to exchange information that then is put to good use and not to undermining even the modicum of kind of political cooperation that's there. And so it is the issue that I think we need to address, of trying to figure out how to deal with what is the larger issue, or several larger issues. One is what is happening within the European Union itself in terms of how the infrastructure works there generally, and how they are dealing with the refugee issue. Then what is happening in terms of intel generally as to what we know, and then whatever processes there are to link these two subjects, of how you vet people well enough to feel comfortable and at the same time not make them feel even less useful and less respected than they already are. I have been talking about the fact that the refugees in many countries have been treated like dogs, and then I always add, but American dogs have a better life than the refugees do. And so I do think that we need to look at it within the context of all those different issues. We have an awful lot to talk about in terms of refugees and investment, and in fact of trying to understand that refugees can be an asset in the countries where they are going, including in the assets of where they, when they return to Syria, and not always see them as a liability. But I do think that what happened in Brussels adds to the level of complication on this, and you have been to Brussels more than most of us, but so I think to you, Mr. Ambassador, but I think that it is an issue that cannot be avoided given already how complicated this issue is.
Jim, thank you very much for the introduction. Madam Secretary, thank you for offering the floor. I might just say to all of you, I first met Madeleine Albright when I was press spokesman for Robin Cook, who was British Foreign Secretary in the late 1990s in Tony Blair's first term. And I came over here with him and Secretary Albright and her press spokesman, also quite a famous figure, Jamie Rubin. They took us out to lunch, actually it was to dinner at a rather good Washington restaurant, and we had the most fascinating discussion about Kosovo, which was then the issue of the moment. And if I were ever to write my memoirs, there would be several pages, maybe a chapter on that event, Madam Secretary, but I probably won't, so yeah, you're safe. But it's a real privilege and honor to be sitting next to you today. Just on the events of Brussels, I did 2 postings in Brussels, so I spent several years of my life there. I used that metro station, which is right next to the Commission and Council buildings many times. I used the airport, obviously, many times. So when I saw the film of it on our TV channels yesterday, it really hit me, and I still wonder about whether anyone I know has been involved in it. There will be a temptation in my own country to argue, particularly as we're in the midst of our debate about membership of the European Union, that these events are an excuse to, or an argument for, pulling up the drawbridge and trying to close off Europe and the rest of the world, and just trying to build barriers. My own view is that is not a policy that could work, not least because, by the way, our own experience of terrorism in the UK, and remember back in 7/7 it's called, but several years ago, when we had some bombings on the London Tube and the London buses, those were homegrown. Those were people from our own Muslim community, British passport holders who had been radicalized. So the idea that somehow if you pull up the drawbridge, you can stop this, you can close off the rest of the world, and that's an answer, doesn't work. So I think, as so often, the Ignatius recipe for what we should be doing is exactly right. What we need to do in Europe is we need to develop better, more effective structures for intelligence sharing. We need to have, we already have a Schengen information system for monitoring people coming into the European Schengen area and coming out. And although the UK is not part of that, we have access to that data, and that all needs to be improved and speeded up so that it's much, much more instant and more effective. We need to share best practice on how to counter radicalization, because ISIL, Daesh are the best online radicalizers that the world has ever seen. We need a lot more investment in our intelligence and security agencies. We are putting another 2 billion in the UK into this as a result of our Strategic Defence and Security Review, which reported last November. But frankly, we think some of our European partners could do a lot more as well, both in investing more, but also in rationalizing structures and removing silos and making sure information is shared within governments as well as between governments effectively. I think there is a debate still going on which needs to be resolved in the right place about the right balance between people's understandable wish for privacy in their communications and the need for us to have the means to protect their security and to keep our countries safe. And last but absolutely not least, we need to reach out to our own Muslim communities and to the refugees. We are going to take 25,000 Syrian refugees over the next few years. We need to look after them, help them to integrate and make sure they don't become ghettoized and radicalized. So we need a comprehensive mix of policies to cope with the challenges we face. But let's be clear, they're going to take a generation to address and to resolve. This is not something you can possibly do in the next few months or even the next couple of years.
Thank you. So I also just wanted to note that we are live streaming this event, and you will be able to look at the. It will be archived on the Aspen website. We are also live tweeting with hashtag with Syria and then note at Aspen Institute. And at some point, someone can explain to me exactly what that means. I'm waiting to see if Twitter catches on before I join, but just. But anyways, maybe just sort of as a starting point. Obviously, everyone here is familiar with the crisis in Syria itself, and obviously the broader impact of refugees across the region and into Europe. We sort of are taking this a little bit of a focus of refugees in the region, really where the vast majority of them are, and the impact that is having on the countries neighboring Syria, and then what can be done in the long term. Obviously, there's an immediate humanitarian response that needs to be considered and funded, but we're also looking at what the long-term solutions are. So one of the things, we put together a small working paper that became a larger report that is available on the MEII website, and it will be distributed broader than that. But really just puts forward some ideas. There are many, many more ideas, and we'll talk about them in the second panel in particular. But really to get there, to get to a long-term response, requires a lot more coordination, a lot more diplomacy. The first major, I think, attempt at this was a donor conference in London at the beginning of February, officially called the Supporting Syria and Regional and the Region Conference. I think we need to think of marketing maybe a little bit better, but it was supported by the UK government, Germany, Kuwait, Norway, and the United Nations. And at the conference, there were pledges made for over $11 billion in assistance, $5.8 billion for 2016, and a further $5.4 billion for 2017 through 2020. And that allows a lot of the partners and others, aid organizations, to do a little bit more long-term planning. We're getting there in terms of thinking about a longer horizon. But I think really critical at the conference, too, was also the ambitious goals that were discussed and debated and put forward, in addition to raising the funds, but is also how do you educate, how do you employ, how do you create economic opportunities to truly transform the lives of the refugees in the region, and how do you also at the same time help transform the economies of the countries neighboring Syria, the host communities, because as Secretary Albright said, refugees coming to these communities could be an economic asset in the long run if we look at it that way. And what is the grand bargain? How can we, as the United States, as Europe, how can we play a role with the local host communities in supporting these refugee populations? So, in thinking about this, David Miliband, for example, with the International Rescue Committee before a Senate testimony in September, called for a Marshall Plan for the region. I think about it in terms of a grand bargain of what the local communities can do and what the United States and Europe can do to support. All of that is going to take greater coordination and greater diplomacy. And so I think I turn to two great diplomats to ask, to some extent, how do we get that process started? How do you start putting that all together, knowing we don't have all the answers right now? And maybe I'll turn to Secretary Albright first, and then.
Well, thank you. And Jim, I think you've put the plate on the table well in terms of understanding what we want to do. And I must say that I'm very impressed with the report, because it really has kind of not only outlined but filled in some aspects of what can really be done. Let me just say that it is important for us to, the course that I teach is called the National Security Toolbox, and there is that kind of sense that there are not a lot of tools in there, and one of them is obviously assistance. And the fact you talk about that London conference, it is money when it's finally actually people live up to their pledges, and we then have it be directed by various parts of ex-government to the right places and to make sure that it really does what it's supposed to do. I think the plan that you are thinking about has a broader context, which is not, this is definitely one of those things, do you give the people a fishing rod or a fish? I mean, basically, I often say you have to change the fishing industry. And so here we have to change the kind of approach to this. And the approach to it is that, in fact, you are going to begin to create a way for there to be a plan to improve the economies, and then try to figure out how to develop the various institutions that then will allow there to be a regular flow that isn't just assistance, that is people helping themselves. I do think that ultimately many of the issues are local, but more than that, they are regional. The thing that I have found, I hate to say this, is that in the international community, there is more likely to be duplication than, in fact, coordination. And what needs to really happen, I think, for starters, is to have an inventory of who is doing what, and try to figure out which organization, and I think that you'll be talking about that somewhat later, but I do think that's an important part. I think the question is whether there is a currently existing regional organization that could do much about it. My own sense, frankly, is no. And so the question is whether having a deliverable, so to speak, is a motivating factor to create an organization. And one of the things that you are talking about, nothing is like the Marshall Plan. I mean, the bottom line is the Marshall Plan was unique. It was dealing in Western Europe in a number of different ways. But I do think that there are valid parts that one needs to look at, that the Marshall Plan wasn't just money. The Marshall Plan really was infrastructure that kind of showed how the money could be used, what organizations needed to be used. The UN or the international system is very good at creating ad hoc coalitions or organizations that can, in fact, do the lifting. And I would think that one of the things that might be kind of the goal here is to use the catalyst of this plan to then develop an organization of the players in the region that then could be supported from the outside. But that, as far as I can see, I don't know whether you'd agree, is whether that there isn't something, the Arab League can't do this, I don't think. And so the question is whether there's some way to create a regional organization. I have also just come back from the Middle East, and under the auspices of another organization, the Atlantic Council. And one of the things that we have been looking at, actually, is whether there are tentacles of some kind of a regional organization, because some of the problems are local, but a lot of them really are regional, and it's that kind of input that I would suggest. So using this plan as a catalyst to put together a regional organization.
Absolutely, and you know, one of the things I found very encouraging about the London conference is that it appeared to me, at least as an observer, that this was a conference that was designed with real deliverables in and of itself and real follow-up. And so maybe also, as you think about how to respond, what is the UK government doing to continue that momentum going forward?
Jim, thank you. If I may, two very quick, and I promise I won't labour these points, two very quick preliminary points, which is that, of course, in Syria we need a comprehensive approach which also addresses the causes of the conflict and which addresses the threat to all of us that ISIL, that Daesh represent. And you know, on the first, I just wanted to pay tribute to John Kerry's efforts and leadership, which have been extraordinary. We're all part of this process to try and get a cessation of hostilities, get humanitarian access, and get a political process going. But John Kerry has worked extraordinarily hard to deliver that. I think he's just landed in Moscow. I was talking to State Department yesterday about his visit, and he will go determined to insist that Russia does more to persuade the Assad regime to give full humanitarian access. He will insist that Russia does more to get Assad to actually implement properly the cessation of hostilities, and most of all, he will look for a commitment that at some point soon President Assad will step down. Because one of the striking things about what has happened in recent days in Syria is as soon as the levels of violence drop, you find thousands of people back out on the streets demonstrating against the Assad regime. And it just shows that the opposition to him and to what he has done is as strong as ever. And you're never going to get a comprehensive solution there until he agrees to get out of the way. On the fight against Daesh, look, we just have to continue with that, and we in the UK are doing. We have a lot of aircraft involved in the military campaign, and at some point in the next year or two, we will have to retake Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria, and defeat the idea that there is a sort of state there that this terrorist organization can command. Look, on the fundamental question, the important question you asked, though, it's just worth as you said, reminding ourselves that this is the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet and one of the worst there has ever been. It's killed more than 250,000 people, 4.5 million refugees outside the country, 13.5 million Syrians inside the country in need of help and humanitarian aid. In the UK alone, we've committed 4 billion to assist those affected by the conflict, and promised to take in 25,000 refugees. That 4 billion contribution is the biggest single humanitarian aid contribution we in the UK have ever made to any country. But of course, by itself, it's not enough, and that's why Prime Minister Cameron was so keen to lead on the organisation of the conference that took place in London in February. We co-hosted that with Germany and Norway and Kuwait and the United Nations, more than 30 heads of state and government, more than 90 humanitarian human rights groups. What that conference produced, first of all, was a total pledge of more than 11 billion, which I think was the single biggest sum ever pledged in a single day for any humanitarian crisis anywhere. Most of that will go to the needs of the people inside Syria and in the camps in the region. But while those day-to-day needs are obviously crucial, we thought it important to focus also in this conference on the longer term, on two issues in particular, on trying to create the conditions under which more than 1 million Syrian children can get some education, whether they're in the camps or displaced or wherever, and to try to create the conditions in which some jobs can be created. The objective there is also 1 million plus jobs. And how are we doing it? Well, a number of ways. We are working with the international financial institutions to see what programs we can set up to encourage job creation. We're working with them to get loans and in some cases grants to the countries in the region to help them create the conditions for jobs. We are working with our European partners to try and open our markets. I mean, we're always great believers in the UK in market opening. Not all of our European partners see things quite the same way, but it's crucial now that we actually open our markets to produce from the neighbouring countries to Syria, so that there is some job creation in those countries that can take up some of the million or so, 4 million people who are displaced. If you take just one country, Jordan, which is one country we have very close relations with, we are working with them extremely closely. They are a middle-income country, which means they wouldn't automatically qualify for some of the trade benefits that Europe allocates to poorer countries. But we're going to change that, we hope, and try and ensure they get some of these concessions. And we're working with the World Bank to try and get loans going to this country that can, again, help its economy and create jobs. And the tricky thing here is to try and get some quick wins out of this rather than something that takes years to achieve results. But on what you said, Madam Secretary, about the need for international coordination. At the moment, we are, I confess, doing this largely bilaterally, the UK with the countries in the region. But of course, it is important to coordinate. It's important to do complementary activity rather than to duplicate one another, and some sort of, whether ad hoc or using international organizations, some structures to make sure all of that works sensibly, and we are all working together to achieve these objectives would, of course, be good.
Thank you. Now, I've got plenty more questions and we could go on forever, but I thought also it might be nice to open it up to this group. So if anyone has some immediate questions, anything that, excellent. What am I calling you?
Thank you. This actually, it's been very, very interesting looking at Syria, but I wanted to open it up just a little bit and look at maybe some of the structural issues in the region, because you have Syria is a current crisis and looking at it, but you also have Yemen kind of building in that direction, and you have Libya, Libya currently also has a bit of a refugee crisis happening, and it's a concern a lot when dealing with Yemen. And Secretary Albright, you had a very interesting idea of a regional mechanism that allows for this, and both touched on security and economy. One of the issues I think that we need to really address in the region is good governance, reform, accountability, specifically within the areas of conflict, what this looks like, and understanding that there's a balance between bringing all the actors to the table and how do you institute accountability mechanisms. So I'd like to hear a little bit more on how these can be integrated to account for what I call the three-legged stool, whether it's security, economy, development, and then good governance and accountability and human rights as being the three areas needed to focus on to create stability in any upcoming country, whether you're talking about Syria or others.
Let me say that the issue of governance generally in all these countries is of major import because it covers everything in terms of rule of law and who owns land and any number of different aspects of it. And also the problem, you were talking about employment generally. Part of the issue, refugee or not, in all these countries, unemployment is the biggest problem. And it's partially because the governments in the region were the place of the first hope of employment before, or subsidies. And when that's gone away, all of a sudden there are more unemployed people. And there is the real conflict between refugees who are coming in and need jobs and the people that are there permanently and need jobs. And so that creates a more than unpleasant situation. I think the thing, and if I might just on one thing, having been in Jordan and seeing what it's like to go to the camps and seeing that people there are filled with the entrepreneurial spirit. I think being in the Syrian camp where they've kind of developed they call it the Champs-Élysées, where they have developed little boutiques of trading things. And then also just being in Amman and seeing that there are numbers of refugees there who are not living in the camps that are competing with a lot of the Jordanians who want the jobs. So that is the issue. I think one of the hardest questions that we have now in the whole both national and international governance is how you get different groups to sit at the table from the beginning. And one of the issues that's been out there always, it's a problem at the UN or wherever, is how you get non-state actors, some of whom are corporations or NGOs, how they get into something early, not late, because the states aren't dealing with this. So I would suggest if, in fact, there is a new organization of some kind created, that the NGOs and private corporation have an equal voice at the table in terms of who the stakeholders are on this. Because the governments, frankly, are not dealing with everything. And they need the help of the private sector in every single way. So that would be one thing. The other is to try, I think one of the things, I guess it goes without saying, is there are immediate short-term problems. And then there are the medium to longer term opportunities. And I don't think we're focusing on this in terms of the opportunity part of it and realizing that we're dealing with people that are, for one reason or another, really filled with impetus and an entrepreneurial spirit, and that they want to be a part of something new. And so the question is how to create a legal system that comes from the medium and long term that allows women to own land, or a number of different ways where there is a different approach, or where there's a functioning commercial code. I mean, if we're going to talk about private sector and we want them to invest in Tunisia, they have to, in fact, there has to be a functioning parliament or legislative branch that does that. So I think we have to lay out kind of a timeline, short-term, immediate, and then this particular group, MEII, I think we have to focus more on the medium to long-term here. And for that, you do need an organization where non-state actors can sit at the table from the beginning and not kind of be brought in to fix the problems after.
Just a couple of thoughts to add. This is a really big question. You can't do it justice in an answer of a couple of minutes. But I go back to the Arab Spring when I was actually British ambassador to the European Union in Brussels. But there was a lot of hope at that time when a number of governments around the Middle East that were A, deeply incompetent, B, repressive, and C, corrupt, were challenged by their populations and were overthrown. There was a huge amount of hope, certainly around Europe, that we were seeing, I mean, hence the name, the Arab Spring, that we were seeing a dawn of a new era in the Middle East. And a lot of ideas then about a Marshall Plan. I remember the then British Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, coming across to Brussels and doing a big speech which was laying out how the European Union could contribute to this new start for the region. And to be frank, for a whole range of reasons, it's not worked out like that. And this is, it really makes you think about where we went wrong, or whether we could have done things differently, or how much it was actually down to how the West intervened or didn't intervene, and how much it was down to the failings of politicians and leaders in the countries concerned. Take one example, Libya, which I went to maybe half a dozen times when I was National Security Advisor. I think that we do need, in Western capitals, to look at how we handle Libya after the revolution, after the overthrow of Gaddafi, and think about whether we should have done things differently and whether we could have changed things. And I think we in the UK, in London, certainly underestimated just how deep the tribal structures were in that country and how deep the enmities and how difficult. I mean, we thought it would be much easier than it was to try and make them work. There's also a responsibility that lies with Libya's leaders and politicians post-revolution, and they are still, to this day, arguing about the makeup of the cabinet. And we still, after the country has more or less fallen apart, still arguing about the division of spoils there. And there is a responsibility on them as well to try and work for their country. My Prime Minister has a concept that he talks about a lot, which is the golden thread. Look at countries that have come out of poverty towards stability and prosperity. A number of features are common to all of them, and it's basically about good governance, but it is about, in particular, about accountability and transparency, and absolutely critically, the rule of law. And he calls it the golden thread. But these are the principles that basically, if adopted, can lead a country in the right direction, and we don't see enough of them in the region. And there's a question about whether how much the support we give these countries can be conditional on them adopting these principles and these characteristics. The other factor, which I would say just as a long-term Eurocrat, in the European Union, we just should have opened our markets earlier and more completely to these countries, because if you don't take their products, you will end up taking the young and dynamic people who want to have a future. And so if they're going to have a future in their own countries, they need to be able to make things that you can sell. And if your markets are closed to their products, then there is no hope for them. So we certainly made mistakes there.
Thank you. I'm going to be speaking on the second panel, but I guess I won't have anything to say because Mrs. Albright is already speaking the mind of Syrians. Thank you very much. So we're all here to fight terrorism. This is one of the main important issues. I think two terrorist parties were mentioned, one of them in the context of uniting our efforts against them, and the other in the context of convincing them to accept aid to enter their territories, which is frankly a little bit absurd. But anyway, the UK has taken so far 0.05% of the refugee population, the US 0.06%. The UK and the US are the two biggest donors for the humanitarian crisis, and we thank both governments for their support. But how can we look at these numbers in terms of, a real intention to support the Syrian people beyond just in the region, but also helping them? I mean, if refugees will arrive here in illegal ways and risk their lives, we cannot expect very high integration, which will lead to more terrorism. So I would like to hear your thoughts on this point, please, if possible. Thank you.
I think I know what I can say, which is I'm an immigrant and was certainly treated well in this country. But I do think that the United States has to take in more. I fly across the United States fairly frequently. It is a large country and there's plenty of room. I think the thing that we have to work out now is because of what I call the fear factor that has been encouraged by, I'm obviously a Democrat, by the other side, that has done more and more in the last 24 hours to damage our reputation further, that what we need to do is to have enough people doing the vetting, which is possible to do as rapidly and as humane way as possible, and I think try to figure out where the refugees can go. I think it goes back generally to this idea that we need to see refugees more as assets in terms of not just liabilities, but enemies. And so I do think there is a process in the United States. I took out the sheet. It's very long, but there are steps. It does require people taking their job seriously and really going through the process. I also think that it's, having tried to be a diplomat in my day, is that it is hard to tell other countries what to do if we are not doing our share. And so I think it isn't always that we can pay for it. It's nice if we give the money, but the bottom line is I think we have to figure out how to take more refugees here.
Here, sorry. Thank you very much. Can I come to Turkey briefly, because I think the EU-Turkey agreement is likely to put more pressure for Turkey to manage an increasing number of refugees or migrants. Turkey has recently talked about giving work permits to refugees. It's still extremely hazy of what shape it will take. But it's a good news, and it's certainly something where perhaps the EU contribution could try to hook itself to make this work. At the same time, because of the spat with Russia, the tourism industry in Turkey is down dramatically, losing jobs every day. I think occupancy rate on the Aegean coast is about 10% now in hotels. Turkish companies in Russia have lost a lot of money, so the private sector in Turkey is not going to be able to invest very much right now. And with the issues they have with the Kurds, are foreign companies prepared to invest in Turkey? So the idea of giving work permits is a good one, but how do you create jobs in this context? And I know you're trying to look at the longer term, and certainly I can understand how useful it is to plan for the years to come, but immediately, how can we take advantage of what is happening in the relationship with Europe, additional money, but also more pressure on Turkey at a time when I don't think private sector will be very keen to give a hand? Where do you see solutions?
Can I just do a two-finger on that? Only because I was, Eleanor Issa from Human Rights First, I was actually in Turkey at the time that this announcement happened, and we met with refugees, and their first question was, yes, but there aren't jobs. Like, you know, it's great, they were appreciated the announcement of potential work authorization, but the Syrians we spoke to wanted to know, you know, could we actually find jobs? Could this be meaningful? And I think this is love that if there's any other points on this, but I think, you know, on the next panel we're going to really try to dig down and some of the broader questions of practically how you do exactly that. How do you encourage job creation in these very challenging locations? You know, I think there's some practical solutions, things that are being done, but I think that we can do more in terms of incentivizing businesses, creating mechanisms such as risk insurance and guarantees and other things to make it that much more attractive, try to mitigate some of the risks that those they may perceive. Even if it's not real, it's still very real from a credit decision. So, absolutely. Any other thoughts on Turkey?
I mean, just on Turkey, first of all, we would say we have to recognize the contribution that Turkey is making. I mean, they've taken in, I think, maybe a couple of million refugees, and it's been an extraordinary effort on their part. And of course, there's a huge problem with finding jobs for them. The deal that was done with the European Union recently does mean that refugees trying to cross into Greece will go back. But there is also an agreement, part of the agreement is that refugees in Turkey can apply to come into Europe, and they will get in, quite a lot of them. So it's not as if everything is being bottled up in Turkey and there's an end to refugees coming to Europe. But the problem about job creation is a real one. It's not that long ago when Turkey was one of the fastest growing economies in the world and looked like a huge economic success story. And obviously things feel a bit different now, and Turkey is facing problems and all that. The only answer, and it's not an instant answer, is to give them as much help as we can from the European Union. There is a customs union already with Turkey, so the markets are, on the whole, quite open, though they can still be opened further. I think there can be a boost to the negotiations for eventual Turkish membership of the EU. And we'll need to find other ways of supporting them, both politically and economically. But it's a hugely challenging moment for Turkey, and they just need us with them, recognizing the problems and the challenges that they face, trying to be sympathetic to their concerns about, for example, Kurdish terrorism, trying to help them in their relationship with the current bad relationship with Russia, and just find other ways of supporting them.
Just say, I think that I have never seen anything as complicated as what is going on in the whole region, in terms of everybody has something, an excuse, or doesn't like the people next door to them, or if they did, they don't anymore. And I think even those of us that spend our lives looking at this part of the world, it is hard to keep track of who's on whose side on any given hour. it's always also a little passing strange for President Erdogan to be criticizing President Sisi about arresting people. So there is an awful lot of chutzpah. But anyway, I do think that if this were easy, we would not be talking about it in terms of trying to sort out how to do something immediately to relieve the terrible humanitarian aspect of smuggling and people drowning, and then trying to take a longer, deeper look, which is what I think we need to do here. But I do think at the same time we can't forget about the immediate humanitarian aspects and why, in fact, it is taking the international community so long to process people or set up camps or do different things. And so I hope that we spend time. But this truly, it is not a matter of the fact that outsiders are stupid and don't, I mean, it's so complicated. Every time you decide to move something here, something else happens. The Turkish issue is a very, very complicated one for all the reasons you've said.
Okay, it'll be fast. Joel Charney from the Norwegian Refugee Council U.S. office. To me, a transition thing that we can do now that I think would point us towards the midterm is this whole education thing. I mean, I appreciate that you all are thinking big picture, long term, but this would have an immense and immediate impact, both as a confidence building measure and laying the groundwork for future success in terms of the long-term project. So as complicated as it is right now, if we can get Syrian kids in Lebanon and Jordan into schools where they're studying within a Syrian framework, I think that would be huge, and that's something that we can do right now.
Absolutely, and I think that's a perfect transition to, I think we're going to take a small break here, and then at about 3:10, come back to really drill down and start talking about some practical ideas, solutions, things that are happening in the region. One of the things, back to the jobs issue, the data show, and this is throughout the world, that refugees who are given the right to work, who are given access to local labor markets, are a net plus to the economy. Yes, there are some immediate short-term costs. There are infrastructure needs. There's all sorts of immediate challenges. But I think to the extent that we can think about ways to incentivize local governments, the governments of the host countries, to move in that direction, maybe it's through providing greater aid, investment, trade access, all of that, we can help create a more hospitable environment for these populations that will ultimately benefit those local communities. And so hopefully we'll talk about that more. Yeah.
Jim, I do think one thing that's worth thinking about is some kind of pilot project, having in fact the various things you've suggested, whether in Syria or Jordan, but to at least put into work the political risk insurance and the bonds and the loan guarantees and try to do a test case of some kind. Absolutely. I think that.
So we'll adjourn for, there's some cookies out there, some coffee, I think. We'll adjourn for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and continue our discussion. So thank you very much.
Started.
Well, thank you everyone for making it back. It sounds by the volume of the conversation that we have not we've not lost enthusiasm. So this section now, our thought is to drill down further, and I've got questions and other things that I could keep the conversation up here going as a panel for a long time, but as our panelists here make some just introductory thoughts, start thinking of questions or things in areas that you want to take the conversation, because we really want to foster a roundtable discussion and not just be a bunch of talking heads. This is a fantastic group. I think I was talking with Vanessa. I think it's interesting that all our panelists, save one today, have been women. And so I told the ambassador that he was our diversity candidate for the afternoon. But really no match in terms of background and experience. So my toughest task for the day is to pronounce Elena's last name, which is Ianchovichina.
Excellent.
Excellent.
You get an A.
Excellent. So Elena is a senior economist at the World Bank and has really focused deeply on the areas of refugees and the host countries and the countries neighboring Syria. And she has been an invaluable resource in talking to Vanessa and our team as we've sort of done some real thinking about how to address this crisis, and some of, both from a baseline, what was the nature of the economies of the neighboring countries starting, and then what has been the impact of refugees on these economies, and that'll help us think a little bit about how we move forward, how we address the jobs issue, how we address the education issue, and whatnot. Dr. Rouba Mhaissen is also an economist, an active and development practitioner. We thought that it was really critical to have a representative from a local NGO who with on-the-ground experience. One of the recommendations that we made in our report is that local NGOs, organizations are an invaluable resource. They are through trial and error, through just the immediacy of the situation, coming up with very creative, very flexible solutions to the refugee issue, and they're a very valuable source that we need to be listening to. So thank you for being here. It was sort of a happy coincidence that she was in town. And then finally, Andrea Koppel from Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is obviously a very well-known, large U.S. NGO that is doing fabulous work on the ground. And we were just talking before this that they're involved along the lines of what Secretary Albright was saying in a number of pilots in the region, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what are the key elements of that. And so hopefully we can get very, very practical in this conversation. So why don't we just go right along the row here and start with Andrea for some just brief framing remarks, and then we'll get into some questions and hopefully have a conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jim. Good afternoon, everybody. Want to thank the Aspen Institute for inviting me to participate this afternoon. We have been working inside Syria now continuously for more than a decade. Most recently over the last 4 years, responding to the needs of Syrians and host communities in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and inside Europe since the refugees began migrating there. In particular, Mercy Corps is seized by the urgency of the need to address the rising and growing demands of adolescents in the region. These are kids, hundreds of thousands of them, young people who were just kids at the start of the war and are now on the cusp of adulthood. It may be trite, but it's also very true that these young people represent the future of Syria and the region, and they have been woefully neglected since the beginning of this crisis. We believe that in order for any recovery plan to succeed and the commitments made in London to be achieved, we must harness the energy and the potential of these young people, of the Syrian youth and of the youth of the region, who stand today at a crucial crossroads. They are ambitious and they are hardworking and they are still optimistic. But they've been repeatedly discouraged and they have been routinely ignored. If given the chance, as Secretary Albright so eloquently said, we also believe that these young Syrians can be engines for growth and prosperity in the countries of their exile, and a promise of reconciliation and reconstruction when Syria finally sees peace. Mercy Corps believes that our greatest investment should be in supporting Syrian youth alongside those youth in hosting countries, in realizing their future potential, while simultaneously supporting immediate job creation that is entrepreneurial and based on solid market assessments. So how do we do that? First, the foundation of any economic plan must be a legal one for safe, decent, and fair jobs for refugees. A legal foundation provides parents with greater job security so that there is less pressure for their underage children to work. And it also provides those working age youth with legal employment that is less exploitative. Second, donors, international financial institutions like the World Bank, regional host governments, and NGOs must invest in workforce development programs for both the refugees, both the Syrians and young host community youth, that help them develop both the hard and the soft skills that will ensure that they have the training needed to secure future employment. And finally, third, we need to focus on growing the pie for Syrians as well as for their hosts. Even before the conflict, there was high unemployment. In fact, in your report, Jim, you note that the 2010 assessment by the World Bank was that there would be 100 million jobs that would be needed by 2020 due to the rapid growth and the rapid arrival of youth into the workforce. And that was before the crisis had begun. Based on our programming, we see several areas with particular potential that will create immediate jobs and grow opportunities for the region's youth down the road when they come of age. And I'll be happy to get into the nitty-gritty in the Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. So get us smart on the economy of the region.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think it's a good thing that you talked about the youth and the people, because ultimately whatever happens in the economies of the host economies, where most of the refugees have sought safety and shelter, have had tough economic times. These economies slowed down considerably in the wake of the Arab Spring events. There was high unemployment prior to that, but things got tougher as these economies slowed down, and they had extremely limited fiscal space to respond to the challenges posed by the Arab Spring events. In addition, the refugee inflows overcrowded a very limited infrastructure systems. In both Lebanon and Jordan, there were gaps in infrastructure, and there were problems in service delivery, in particularly in those areas where the Syrian refugees took shelter, in the Bekaa Valley and in some of the areas in Jordan. These are the areas with the higher poverty rates in Jordan. So these challenges actually made a bad situation considerably worse. And it is true that the inflow of refugees boosted consumption of goods and services in these economies, but the pace of economic expansion was much slower than the pace of increase in the population. So overall, average per capita incomes have declined in most of the host economies. And in particular, they have, because of the sudden surge in the incoming people and the supply limitations, in particular the construction sector, we've seen increases in the price of housing, with deteriorating conditions, living conditions that have put immense stress on people, both in the host communities, but also the Syrian refugees. And overall, we have seen competition for jobs intensifying, and many of the Syrians actually live in the communities around in these countries have had to take jobs at very low wages, working informally in poor conditions, but creating competition for those unemployed who want to take up jobs in the Jordanian people and also in Lebanon, the poor Lebanese. So there are tensions that have emerged as a result of this, and this is precisely why these countries need to get support immediately, and this support has to be strategically decided how to be allocated. Because the needs have just kept growing. And I have to draw attention to the recent changes in the global economy with the decline in oil prices. What we have seen is that there is now pressure on aid flows and on remittances going into Lebanon and Jordan. And of course, this has effects on the economic pace, economic growth there. Overall risk perceptions have increased with negative implications for the key sectors, for the employment-generating sectors. Tourism has declined over the past couple of years. But also what we know is that when there is increase in risk perceptions, there is decline in the quality FDI. And so this is precisely the FDI that is capable of creating jobs. And we have done studies on that at the World Bank. And we know that these initiatives that I hear about can really help in that respect because they can encourage the quality FDI, the one that can create jobs, to come into initially in special economic zones, but also more strategically in places where people without jobs are located. So in terms of, to keep it tight, I want to suggest 3 priority areas that perhaps will have to. Something has to be done about these areas now so that there is sustainable growth, because Jordan, Lebanon, and the countries that are hosting the majority of refugees cannot rely on aid-driven models of support for the people who need support there. There has to be a private sector-driven growth, but the problem is that there are long-standing obstacles to private sector growth in both Jordan and Lebanon, and so what needs to be done is the obstacles that prevented competition in the private sector need to be tackled. This will help attract foreign direct investment because many of the sectors have remained close to foreign competition. And so there needs to be a strategy of how to address these long-standing obstacles. And it could be done initially in the special economic zones where the goods will be produced and exported to foreign markets, and so there will be no immediate threat to the domestic economy and the domestic competition, but gradually there should be measures to level the playing field, and companies who enter Jordan could expand operations within the countries and generate more employment. And of course, address the bottlenecks to investments in the basic infrastructure, because these have been there, and therefore there hasn't been investments in water and sanitation, in transport, and in health and education in particular. And we could start with thinking about improving conditions and linkages to the special economic zones so that people can move more freely and can access those jobs more easily. Finally, I want to finish with the importance of the quality of institutions. The first panel reflected on that. Property rights, the governance environment are so important, and I think that has been one of the major obstacles as to why companies in Europe and US have looked elsewhere and not into the markets of the Middle East to locate their companies, their operations. And that's a long-term process. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is good to start, at least in the context of measures that are intended to help the refugees and the host communities. It is important to build institutions that can then be scaled up so that overall quality of governance and institutions in these host economies improve over time. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I'm half Lebanese, half Syrian, which gives me a lot of power to kind of talk on both sides. Thank you for asking us to have framing remarks, because I think one of my duties is to reframe the whole issue. I know we're getting practical, but I cannot but go back and speak for a little bit about the root cause of the Syrian refugee crisis, which is the Assad regime. We've talked about, the U.S. Bringing refugees here and, making them, most importantly, how can we make them stay where they are? How can we make them stay in Syria or in the region? There's a total of 2,600 refugees, who will come to the U.S. But in 1 week, in the beginning of February, the Russian airstrikes displaced 70,000 people. So more than 7 years of refugees that President Obama wants to take into the U.S. Europe is dealing with a lot, and we've seen the recent, what happened in Brussels, and we cannot but, recognize that Europe is under a lot of pressure. But Europe cannot keep doing that. There was an interesting article this morning in which it said that Syria in 2031, at this rate, Syria will be empty. There would be no Syrian left inside Syria. So unless we solve the barrel bombs, the chemical weapons, unless we provide civilian protection, this is going to continue happening. According to SAMS, there was more than 100 chemical attacks on civilians in Syria after 2013. So that's crossing the red line more than 100 times. I'm sure a lot of you here have heard the sentence, how many more? How many more? How many more Syrians have to be killed before the world takes action? So I meet a lot of Syrians, and believe me, all of them want to stay in Syria. All of them want to stay in the camp, which takes me to 3 recommendations with regards to the excellent report that Vanessa and Vanessa has written. The first one is about an integrated approach to development. For everyone who's read about development and who's been working in other places, the Syrian refugee crisis is an unprecedented one, but in a lot of ways, we can draw a lot of parallels from other regions and other places. And the failure of development has been to create a model that is an integrated model with a holistic approach. We cannot, I echo my colleague from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Education is very key, but we cannot talk about education without talking about employment for the parents. We cannot talk about empowering of women if the men are without jobs. I'm going to give you 2 examples from the field. The first is at SAWA, we have schools for children, and in the first shift, we teach the informal Lebanese curriculum. And a lot of the students, we noticed that they had very much problems focusing on in the classes. A lot of them would sit and refuse to remove their backpacks from their bags because to them, at any point in time, they might have to run or, feelings of insecurity. So we introduced a program called the Harmonic Education Program, in which we were supporting students by teaching them core materials through music, arts, sports, and technology. And through that program, we saw a lot of improvement. But how we did the program is by employing mentors from the field, Syrian mentors and Syrian teachers from the field, and employing them through a small loophole in the Lebanese system, which is cash for work. And through that, we were able to, create jobs for the Syrian community. Unfortunately, a lot of donors like to focus on women empowerment programs, but out of context. Don't get me wrong. Unfortunately, not because I'm against women empowerment, to the contrary, but if you look at women empowerment without looking at the structure of the whole family and at the customs of these countries, you are doing women a disfavor. If women empowerment programs happen and the men are sitting without jobs, with 10-15 men in the tent, 10-15 members in the tent without an ability for intimacy, and the men aren't having any jobs, empowering women in that context by giving them jobs, out of context of the whole family will be very, very bad. We have done field assessments at SAWA, and we realized that the women empowerment programs on their own have caused an increase in gender-based violence. So we need to increase, jobs for women, but that needs to happen in parallel to also giving opportunities for men. Men and youth from the age of 15 and above, 13 even and above, have been a lost category. No one wants to work with these two categories, and this is something that we really need to look at. So, just the first point is the holistic approach to development. The second point is about empowering the local organization. Local organizations are often treated as implementing partners. These organizations are not given core funding. Most of the funding that is being given is very short term. We're trying to have a coalition against the international community, I'm just kidding, but not to accept any more funding, which is between 6 months and 18 months. We all know in this room that this is a protracted crisis. We shouldn't deal with it anymore as a short-term crisis, not only in terms of recommendation for strategy, but also thinking really how to empower the local organizations. We need funding for 2 years, we need funding for 3 years, we need funding for 5 years. We need to be able to draw long-term strategies and long-term programs. To be able to do that, we also need core funding. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations refuse to give funding for core staff, which means the majority of our staff are either taken by international organizations or they're, for a very short time and then waiting to the next project cycle. This is something that needs to be addressed. A lot of organizations refuse to give salaries to the families. If one staff loses their lives in Syria, a lot of organizations refuse to give salaries to their family, even within the time frame of the project. A lot of the organizations refuse to give salaries for women who are on maternity leave within the time frame of the project. All of these issues need to be addressed seriously if you really want to empower local organizations. I'm very happy that Mrs. Albright spoke very highly about local organizations who are in fact doing the majority of the work. And I'm very happy that she also mentioned dignity. And honestly, it's the first time I hear a world leader talk about the Syrian dignity in humanitarian work. Unfortunately, this has been absent a lot. And it is the Syrian organizations who are there to ensure that all the programs, ensure dignity, ownership, and agency for the people. We are there to serve them, to support themselves, rather than, just implementing, being looked at as just implementing partners. Which brings me to my last point, which is really a lot of us in this room has agency over, which is the counterterrorism legislation, which is affecting a lot of our work on the ground. It's affecting, a lot of the transactions. I don't see any problem Daesh receiving or taking money, but for us, even $1,000 can be very problematic to receive. This is really obstructing our work, and I think the fighting terrorism starts with empowering civil society. Civil society is the opposite, the opposite, of terrorism is civil society. So if you want to fight terrorism, the start is to empowering the locals, to empowering the young men and women in the camps. I want to leave you on a positive note. Also, like I said, you said a lot of the points that I've been saying, so I'm trying not to repeat them. But it is an opportunity. The refugee crisis is an opportunity. Unfortunately, it's been taken as an opportunity in a lot of the wrong ways, but actually it is an opportunity in the right way. When I think about the Armenian community, when I think about the Jewish community around the world, I see that the Syrian community is gonna, stand up and revive itself again. In the camps, there are amazing youth with great talents. There are amazing children that we have to educate. There are amazing men and women who are, more than ready to take on, jobs, to take mentoring. Please reach out to us in order to be able to look at this as a positive light and a positive hope, despite all the grim pictures all around the region. And I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Just a point of clarification. I just, when you were talking about the counterterrorism legislation, you were referring to the very specific legal requirements that fall on you because they fall on your donors.
Yes.
That you've got to do a OFAC check and everything on everyone you give money to, right?
Yes.
Even small dollars.
Exactly, and also about banking,
Right.
because a lot of banks are closing accounts for civil society organizations.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to get money to civil society organizations inside Syria, and those in the region, it's also very, very difficult. So that was also my point.
We've, as the Middle East Investment Initiative, we have staff in Ramallah and the West Bank. We just this week got a call from Arab Bank, even though our funding is coming from Norway, Sweden, USAID, and OPIC, same issues.
Yes.
It is, and we have resources,
Yes.
legal resources and others in the U.S., whereas small organizations do not. So I think that is just, from a bureaucratic standpoint, something we should address, let alone some of these larger issues. Maybe quickly, some quick questions, I think, and then I'd love to open the conversation. But sort of setting the table, I'd love to hear a little bit more from an economic standpoint. We talked about how these were already challenged economies, and now they have this larger influx. One of the challenges of trying to get local reforms, whether they be economic or legal, is talking about what the benefit they could receive if they give refugees the right to work or others. Maybe you could help explain a little bit of the economic thinking behind that, so that collectively we can think about how the conversation goes diplomatically.
That's a great question. I think that I cannot agree more with the statement that ideally what should happen is that there should be a realization that the Syrian refugees offer skills and abundance of labor that can be leveraged together with the financing that has been pledged to enhance opportunities for everyone in the host communities. However, looking back at the initial conditions, we realize that there has been difficulty in creating conditions for vibrant private sector growth. There has been a study that was done by the World Bank recently, Jobs versus Privileges, and what my colleagues found is that unique set of enterprise surveys became available after the Arab Spring, and so we've done this work in Tunisia and Egypt, and we find that the regulations were actually favoring those in power, and creating much more difficult conditions for unconnected firms to grow. And so what we observe throughout the Middle East actually is a very stagnant firm sector. We have the large firms that usually have connections to the top, and they have been there, some type of monopoly power. And then we have the small firms. In fact, jobs are created mostly by small firms. But these firms don't grow, well, some of them, we don't expect that all of them will grow, but in normal economies, like in Turkey, for example, we have some studies done on Turkey. The Turkish small firms had conditions to grow in the pre-Arab Spring period into medium-sized firms, and then create a lot more jobs for Turkish workers. But this didn't really happen in many of the countries for which we have information. And that really suggests that we have very big difficulties today when we, in addition to the workers who are native, who are citizens of these countries, we have an inflow of Syrian workers. And this, in times of high growth, would be really a blessing. But now it seems that we have to think of ways to turn this challenge, which they face, into this sort of blessing, because we don't have the conditions for that. And I think that I can stop here.
No, and one other thing that I just think is, we often talk about the region, we talk about the neighboring countries, but really we're talking about three very, very different situations in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And I was wondering if maybe you could quickly just talk about some of the, from an economic standpoint, some of the differences, because they treat refugees differently, they're different economies, they're different situations.
Yes, you're very right, and I think that we have now information that Turkey, for example, the situation there differs a lot, because the refugees are just a tiny share of the population in Turkey. I mean, according to my calculations, more recently, I could be wrong, but I think it's below 5%, something around 3%. by contrast, we have Lebanon, where we have every third person, I think 33% are of the Syrian refugees are the share in total population. And in Jordan, it's 1/5, I believe. So first, the concentration rates are very different and creating much bigger challenges. But what we know is that Turkey's economy was much better prepared to actually offer opportunities despite language differences. There were trade links that many of the Syrian companies build upon. And on the overall, we know now that many of the businesses in Syria relocated to neighboring countries also, creating jobs for Syrians and Turkish workers. And so there has been some sort of investment going on as well. Now, in Lebanon, we have a different type of the profile of the refugees changes a little bit, and that creates also maybe more people coming more from rural areas, relocating, and they're offering mostly labor. And they're mostly working in the agricultural sector or doing some low-level, low-skill jobs in services. And in Jordan, it's sort of a mixed bag. I think that we have a very smaller share of people located in the camps, but then most of the refugees are in the local communities and trying to make a living. And the situation also, I agree with the previous remarks, that they are also cultural, because the majority of refugees are women and young people, children, dependents, and also older people who don't have anyone to take care of them. So we have great dependency, usually within the families. And we have women, some of them worked when they were in Syria, but some who were in rural areas, they did not participate in the labor market. So we have multiple stressors here where, yes, we could offer jobs to refugees in special economic zones, but we should think how are they able to take up these jobs. And also one very important difference is that the economic zones existed in Jordan, but we know that they employed many people from South Asia and from Asian countries, and at very low wages. And they were mostly companies in textiles and apparel. So my colleagues are challenging me to what extent, if more apparel companies locate there, they will be able to offer employment to the Syrian workers and even Jordanian and Lebanese workers. Maybe these workers would not want to take these jobs. So we have to be careful, what sort of FDI is attracted, to create incentives, and perhaps through insurance, through some other incentives, to create conditions that these zones can really become vibrant centers of economic activity, as they have been structured in China. In China, we have great diversity of companies located in the zones, which were initially established when China was starting to grow, and conditions that later on integrated and created backward linkages into the economy, so that other firms located in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey can supply these firms and with materials, with parts, components, and so that there is spillover effects deeper into the economy and more jobs created.
Fantastic. So, I'd like to hear a little bit from Andrea and Rouba about, getting into specifics. So I know that Mercy Corps has been working on a number of pilot programs, testing different ideas how to get at some of these root causes. And I know you're on the ground doing some very, very innovative things. And I'd love to sort of hear from both of you, and then let's have a broader conversation.
Sure. So we've heard now mentioned several times that donor funds are finite. They're short term. We have some donors that are giving a few years, but the only way that we're really going to generate the kind of economic development that the region so desperately needs is by attracting private sector there. It's also supporting those micro, small, medium enterprises that already exist or can exist very quickly with some additional technical training. So that's what we're doing in places like Lebanon, working with some of these entrepreneurs. For example, there's one dairy farm in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon that is employing both Syrian and Lebanese workers, and They just needed some help with like a business plan, getting maybe some ideas around strategic planning, and had realized that they saw potential for expansion but didn't quite know how to do it. And by helping them sort of rethink where they were putting their money, we helped them to realize that they could afford to buy a truck, which was going to help them reach farther markets. So that's one small example. So we're working with 20 of these micro, small, medium enterprises in Lebanon to kind of help them in different ways with different reasons. Their needs are different, to help them adapt to the economic forces that are in that country. We're also, like, if you look in Lebanon, I don't know, you mentioned, Rouba, that you're Lebanese as well as Syrian. Anybody who's been to Lebanon in the last several years sees that the trash situation is out of control. What do you do with the trash? Well, one thing you can do is to recycle it. We're working with municipalities there. In fact, we have the municipality of Zakhl, which serves 200,000 residents, helping them to upgrade and refurbish their recycling facility, their waste management facility that's owned by the municipality, and the landfill. So that's another project. But in fact, we need to attract more private enterprise. And how do you do that? So this is an idea, it's a concept that Mercy Corps is in discussions right now with some institutional donors about, and would love to talk with the World Bank more about this. It's called the Syria Tomorrow Fund, and what it is, again, conceptually, is creating a £1 billion 5-year bond that could be resourced by institutional donors. And then you bring in fact, where the Rockefeller Fund Foundation is one of those that we've been speaking with, that would be, perhaps could buy into this fund among other private investors as a way to kind of give private sector some skin in the game that could provide collateral to attract them into the special economic zones, for example, that Elena mentioned in Jordan. So this is, trying to think outside of the box as a way for us to leverage sort of the international financial institutions, like the World Bank, foundations, institutional donors, to come up with some creative new ways to meet needs. Another program that Mercy Corps has been not piloting, but in fact implementing in Gaza, which is, as you know, one of the more challenging environments to work in, is to have an accelerator fund for online programs and training. And it's called the Gaza Sky Geeks Accelerator. And this is something that we see as being a model that is incredibly applicable to these other very hard to reach, hard to access communities, certainly inside Syria and beyond, where you have young people who are highly educated, who are highly motivated, who need help with perhaps creating a business plan, and through a virtual laboratory, you're able to access both the training that you need, business plan guidance, and whatnot, to kind of get your ideas off the ground. These are the kinds of things that we've been investing in over the last several years, with tremendous support from Google.
Absolutely, and Vanessa and I had the opportunity to meet with some of the Gaza Sky Geeks people, and they're fantastic. 2, it's a great program if you want to look up it online. And 3, I think it really shows that if you can create a tech incubator in Gaza, you can really do it absolutely anywhere. And so, Rouba.
It's a small world. I also met them recently in San Francisco, and they're amazing. I just want to clarify about Daesh because I received a text. I didn't say we don't have a problem with Daesh receiving money. I said they don't have a problem receiving money from banks, but we do. Just to clarify that. Okay.
Right, they own banks.
Yes, exactly. So I'm gonna be quick. I'm gonna give a few ideas that we have worked with. So first of all, our refugee community are run totally by refugees. We use our Cash for Work program so that everyone in the community is a giver. 65% of youth in the refugee camps in a recent study in Lebanon have thought about suicide, which is a very, very high rate. We have a lot of people who have, no hope, but we started to generate hope by allowing them to run the communities. They are the teachers in the camps. They clean the camps. They build the tents. We have bakeries in the camps. We have barbershops in the camps. Even when we do huge campaigns to get clothes that are used clothes, we have tailors who come and tailor it for you because a refugee needs to wear something that fits them. They are a human being. It's not just just to cater for the aspect of dignity in the work that we are doing. So one of the ideas is to really foster a community-based approach. The law allows us to do that through Cash for Work. It's a very important loophole that we don't need to really wait for the, all the working permits thing to happen. So this is one of the ideas. A second idea, which you touched upon also, is the trash crisis. So we recently had the idea to really, instead of always treating the refugee crisis as, this burden on the host communities, we have been exchanging a lot of services with the municipality. So we created football teams for the men, which, by the way, decreased gender-based violence a lot. So between camps, we have football tournaments. The municipality offers us the land, and in exchange, the refugees are planting trees around the land and, helping the municipality with various issues. This is a partnership between state and refugees. A partnership between states. We are about to start also a recycling project. We've just, rented the land, and we're going to start, asking refugees to help recycle just to solve the Lebanese, trash crisis issue. We also partnered with a few of Stanford students who started a social enterprise called Natakallam, in which we are recruiting, Syrians from the camps. So SAWA is recruiting the Syrians from the camps, and then Natakallam is recruiting people from around the world who want to learn Arabic, because Syria was the biggest destination for Arabic learning, along with Palestine. And then they are exchanging Arabic lessons over Skype. And let me tell you, this is a lot more than the $10 that these refugees are receiving, because for once, they are not just a number. They are not UNHCR number, I don't know what. They're actually a human being with a name, having a meaningful and nice conversation about Syria, about what they like to do, about food, about any normal thing that they don't have the opportunity to do usually. There's also similar projects done in translation, in graphic design. A lot of these, technology is really revolutionizing the way that we work, and we have to take advantage of that. The last point I want to talk about is the higher education bit, which goes unnoticed a lot. After the age of 13, it's very difficult to bring students back into schooling. And one way to do that is to partner with private, anyway, the education system is in crisis, whether in refugee camps or even the normal students are increasingly choosing to forego, university and all the loans that come with it. So why not partner with private organizations in order to tailor capacity building and training programs that would then, for example, let's recruit 100 Syrian refugees, train them in graphic design, in coding, in specific, skills, and then pair them up with big organizations as part of their CSR, commitment. Exactly. Another small idea is we have tried to approach several huge organizations. I'm not going to list the names, which are private sector organizations, to commit to each staff in that organization, especially those who gain like six-figure numbers in a year, to adopt one Syrian orphan or one Syrian student. That would amount for each employee to $50 per month, which is really not a lot, but it's pulling a lot of students out of the destitution and the lack of schooling. I mean, there are many, many ideas. It's already 4 o'clock. I don't want to go on and on, but.
Actually, Jim, if I could just pick up, because one program that Mercy Corps is working on in Lebanon is similar to that. But what we're doing with the youth is that we're letting them lead some of the market assessments so that it's giving them that exposure to potential employers and the employers the exposure to them. So they can both hone some of their skills and they're paired with mentors as well. But this is an opportunity. I just was struck, Rouba, by what you said with the youth-led. So put them in the position where they're the ones, not that the assessment is done by a development person, but that they're the ones who are engaging with these prospective employers and gathering the information there. And at the same time, we're training them in sort of technical skills like cell phone repair, sewing, other very kind of practical vocational training that they could then apply to the marketplace. And as part of that, you need to train people for jobs that could potentially exist. And that's where the market assessment comes into play.
I think great minds think alike, so this is all.
Yeah, well, and I think what all of this evidence is that this is an enormous talent resource that we need to figure out how to tap into. Exactly. Yes.
Serge Does, International Medical Corps. The British ambassador made a very quick point about open markets, and I wish he'd said a little bit more because he'd be responsible for that. He said one way that refugees could be helped, and host countries and their nationals, is for the EU, and I imagine also the US and other Western states, to open their markets to goods that are produced in those 3 countries. It would lessen dependency on aid, which we all support, and allow goods to be produced, services to be made, but without consumption on the other side, that all comes to naught. Educating children, education for young adults, particularly in technical skills, needs a requirement of purchase and consumption in richer countries. So I'll ask Elena, our World Bank economist, what would have to happen in EU states as well as in the US to be able to engage in this trade? You know, there are a lot of differences between the Arab world and Western states, but one area where there is agreement is on free markets and free economies, transfer of goods without any obstacles. So what would have to happen in the EU and the US to be able to increase this transfer of goods and services between the 2 countries that would stimulate investment and provide more cash into those economies that all would be able to benefit from?
Well, I think that it is easiest for me to think about the case of Jordan and trade with the US. Actually, there is a free trade agreement between the 2 countries. So one would ask the question, why isn't there more trade between the US and Jordan? And I think it's not so much about the trade policies or any sort of tariffs or the usual sort of barriers that we think when we talk about international trade, but about constraints, supply side constraints. And when we have looked at why, for example, the Middle East countries didn't benefit from the number of agreements, free trade agreements, if you take PAFTA, if you take the other agreements they have struck with the European Union, why isn't there more trade created? And it's mostly about the behind the border constraints. What I mean by that is that, take for example, these are not so easy to think about, but these are linkages within the domestic economy. And if you have, for example, a monopoly in telecoms, if you have a monopoly in electricity supply, if you have a monopoly in some of the wholesale suppliers of very important inputs into the production process, what you have is that you have very uncompetitive prices of these goods. So if you have to buy them within let's say the home economy, then, and you cannot, these are sort of non-tradable, usually non-tradable goods and services, then you are stuck with buying them at very uncompetitive prices, which increases the cost of the good that you produce in Jordan, for example. And then, and when the U.S. Looks at possibilities, then they would not go and buy something made in Jordan. They would go and buy something made somewhere else where the costing of the goods taken to produce the final consumption good is lower. And so I think that's why I was emphasizing in my initial remarks the importance of competitive markets. Competitive markets is just something that to think about it in practical terms is to enable businesses to be more competitive and so that they can sell their goods at lower prices, so that they don't have to pay so much for electricity, because if they have, for example, electricity shortages, as they do in many of these countries, they have to use generators. But generators work with more expensive fuel. And so the whole good then, the final product becomes more expensive to produce and becomes uncompetitive. And of course, there are a host of other issues, including quality and what sort of technology these companies use. And it is about also the environment for patenting inventions. Like if the Middle East economies want to attract the quality FDI, they need to have very good environments for patents so that these production processes can be transferred without fear that there will be imitation and sort of violation of these contracts. So it's mostly about improving the environment in the Middle East economies. And that would have huge benefits long term. It will maybe, that's why I was also saying that they should take this challenge as an opportunity to turn around their economies and really break out of this vicious cycle of underperformance in terms of economic growth.
Yeah.
Joel Charney again. I'm afraid I'm going to come across as an aidist or a statist because the project that you're talking about is a generational project. And coming from a humanitarian perspective, what I'm looking for is something in the middle between the generational project and the handouts. So I think what Rouba and Andrea described, I think are maybe good initiatives that perhaps could be scaled up, but to me it's about what can we do in a 2 or 3 year time frame. I mean, I just don't see, private sector investment freed in a competitive environment happening in a time frame that we needed to happen for the Syrian refugees. So, I mean, I want to push you a little bit from a bank perspective. I mean, Jim Kim has more or less put a stake in the ground and said the bank is going to start to reach back and do more work that's more joined up with humanitarian actors. And there's been discussion between UNHCR and the bank, UNDP has been involved. So what I'm interested in is not what the private sector is going to do and not what the Jordanian government needs to do. What can the World Bank do as an institution right now to really start making some of this stuff happen?
I'd love to get your perspective. From my thinking is that it's a combination. That governments and private sector need to link up. World Bank needs to link up on a number of things in order to facilitate. Don't let the enemy be the perfect, the enemy of the good. In the sense that you're right. It is a generational to move the ball in terms of the overall business environment. But can we create incentives through insurance, through guarantees, through other things? So in Palestine, for example, we saw a market failure in the fact that the local banks weren't investing in their local population. Why? Because of perceived risk. Even, these are Palestinian banks. So we created a loan guarantee facility that has now guaranteed about $150 million in lending to small and medium-sized businesses. That type of thing, and obviously it needs to have a local flavor and taking into account local economies. But I think there are a number of things that both the World Bank, the other DFIs, the aid agencies, and others can facilitate help leverage or mobilize private capital in some of these areas. Smile.
But because that was a remark directly to me, because I'm at the World Bank, I just want to add that I don't want to leave out these important areas. We already know that there has to be infrastructure that if it's missing, the private sector won't be able to be successful in operating. And I think here, definitely investments in public investments would play a big role. And I think that the World Bank can help, especially in communities, linking communities, hosting Syrian refugees and enabling them, for example, to reach markets or to be able to go to the places where there is employment for them, or to create employment, invest in schools, in the refugee camps, near the refugee camps where kids can go and educate, and also helping to improve the ability of people to reach, to improve the quality of the teaching in these schools by attracting and subsidizing perhaps employment of teachers in these facilities. That's a big problem. I think that in education and in health, I think the bank can definitely provide support in now and with immediate results, because what we have to do is we have to look at the skills available in these communities and provide training for them to get up to speed. If there are medical people trained in the medical profession that are Syrians, they can work in these places with a little bit of training and then feel good about themselves, earn a living, and feel empowered. But also attract health professionals and good quality teachers to these schools so that the kids are not left behind. Because what I've heard is that there is a big problem in integrating, for example, high school students, Syrian students, into Jordanian schools because of the differences in the curriculums and also differences in the fact that they have missed sometimes even up to 3 years of education because the war has been going on now a fifth year. So I think not to underestimate the importance of this. Perhaps we should think about it in time frame, short-term measures, medium-term measures, and long-term measures. But all of these things we have to start working on now, because if we think, oh, well, the private sector will take a long time to become effective, we won't be able to plan for the things that we need to do now so that the private sector can become an effective engine of growth. And also do the complementary investments that are needed for the private sector to become more productive as they enter Jordan and attract the good quality firms that can create these jobs. So I think.
Why don't we try to get a couple in? Just I'll go around and get a couple questions, and then we'll allow everyone to sort of sum up with their responses. So why don't I just start moving around the room here?
Okay, thank you so much. I have a question for Andrea. Andrea, thank you so much for all the excellent work that Mercy Corps does. A former colleague of mine works for you now, Christy Delafield, and we touch base from time to time. She tells me about all the great work that you do, so thank you. I have two questions. Barrel bombs aren't the only, or were not the only weapon of war that Assad used to to shore himself up in the country or cause internal migration. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, aid was also used by Assad for the same reason. In 2014, Mercy Corps decided to reach populations in Syria outside of Assad control that angered him, and he forced you out of Damascus. What has it been like since then, since 2014, for you? Since now you do the sort of humanitarian work that you do without, as far as I understand, without permission from the Assad regime. Do you regret that decision, or would you encourage other humanitarian organizations to pursue the same thing? And the other question I have is about what Rouba talked about. Rouba said, we can talk all we want and however long we want about ameliorating the situation and measures put in place to help alleviate the symptoms. But what about the root cause of the issue, the conflict itself? Of course, as a humanitarian organization, I don't have an expectation of you to take that on. But what are your thoughts about the safe zone? This is something that Syrians have been calling for and asking for a long time. Of course, some humanitarian organizations cannot voice their an opinion on this because it involves some measure of military action. That's something I understand. However, some humanitarian organizations actually go around and oppose such a measure, although it's clearly a core demand of the Syrian people. So what are your thoughts about this issue? Thank you.
Just back to the economic question, you touched on the issue of expatriate labor. This is something I'm very interested in. I didn't realize until I studied a little bit more that there are tens of thousands of South Asian workers in Jordan, and those are people that they are paying to bring in, and then you have this refugee population. I mean, it's just baffling. In addition to all of the special economic zones, you have the zones that were set up under the U.S. Free Trade Agreement that just ended up, again, bringing in thousands more South Asian workers. These are not sweatshops, or they're not supposed to be. I mean, the U.S. government monitors labor and environmental standards according to our FDA, so they should be paying decent wages. These would be good jobs for Syrians. We can't, obviously, deport tens of thousands of South Asian laborers at one time, but it is something that could be phased. I mean, these people are here on contracts. Can we phase out? Is when your contract is over, you need to go back to your home country, and we're going to give that job to a Syrian? I don't know. Has that been discussed? How can we get away from South Asian laborers and look to Syrian laborers? Just seems a very, like I said, a baffling situation. And it's not just Jordan. I mean, we won't even talk about the Gulf, where you've got millions of South Asian workers working. Those are jobs that could also potentially be, some of them be done by Syrian workers as well. So, thank you.
Yes, Noah Gottschalk from Oxfam, and thanks so much to all of you. I'm actually really glad, Laura, that you went first, because I think the point that I wanted to raise is, it really stems from what you just raised, which is while we're looking at the issue of development and the economic opportunities that refugees can unleash and that can support both the host communities and refugees, we have to be really, really mindful of the risks that unregulated labor can provide. And Joel was worried about sounding like a statist. I'm worried about sounding like an anti-capitalist. But I think true to form. But I think, particularly coming out of the London conference, what we saw was in a number of our organizations released a report called Right to the Future, talking about some of the opportunities for unleashing this type of development across the region, and supporting refugees through those means. But I think what we've seen in the weeks that have followed has been, and including at the conference, really insufficient attention paid to the aspects and recommendations of the report, which dealt with the protection of refugees, issues to do with fair salaries, issues to do with legal residency. I think it'd be really interesting if you have any comments about this, Dr. Rouba in particular, the issue, for example, of the impact of lack of legal residency on freedom of movement for refugees in a place like Lebanon, where checkpoints spring up around the country, and how you can expect to be involved in business activities in that type of environment, where your movement isn't even safe, if at all free. Relating to this issue of other workers, I mean, we've had conversations, for example, with business owners in Jordan who have said, it's great to have the refugees here because we can hire 10 Syrians for the price of one Egyptian. So that was a really interesting remark to hear from this individual, but I think without proper safeguards in place, symptomatic of a broader challenge of integrating Syrians into a labor market where they do have the skills to be more than competitive, while making sure they're not so competitive that they're actually harming themselves, that we're not contributing to child labor or other forms of exploitation of workers. And I also just very finally wanted, Dr. Rouba made a lot of really, really important points, but I wanted to re-emphasize, I think, the point about the direct support to Syrian NGOs and to local NGOs, and particularly this issue of the lack of core funding, which is, I think, a concern that I understand that not only SAWA has experienced, but literally every single of the Syrian organizations, the Lebanese organizations, the Jordanian organizations that we work with in the region have the exact same concern, and it's coming across more and more, and it's something that we really, the donor community has the power to impact today. It's not something that needs years to unleash or months to develop a program. It actually can be changed today. So I wanted to just reemphasize that point. Thanks.
Marie Swade from the Center for Victims of Torture, and I just want to touch on 2 points as this conversation shifts from a refugee sort of emergency response to the development response in the region as a whole. 2 things that I hope just don't get lost, and I welcome any comments on these. The first being something that Andrea and Dr. Rouba touched on, which is this idea of dignity and supporting the youth and other refugees to sort of be the catalyst for revitalizing their communities. And the one piece of this that maybe I'd be interested in having addressed further is as we talk about sort of development, where does the psychosocial support for the small but significant part of the refugee community that has been deeply affected by torture, war trauma, fit into this conversation? Right, or than that we'd hope. So where does that sort of fit into this, and where and losing sort of the capacity of that community to also contribute to community rebuilding and ultimately rebuilding Syria, I think would be a significant failing in sort of the development response as a whole. The second being something that was touched on but not quite addressed fully, and I'd be interested in hearing a little expansion on, is the sort of holistic and diverse refugee population. So we're not talking just about purely about Syrians, but also Palestinians from Syria, to the extent that they've been able to even leave Syria, which is only a small portion, but also Iraqis, Syrians Iraqis that were in Syria for a long time, et cetera. So these other communities that have actually had the biggest difficulty, I think, accessing the refugee, the humanitarian aid in the refugee response, to also sort of not lose that as we move into development. So I'd just be interested in hearing more on that.
I think the Iraqi program back in 2009, where they sent about 50,000 Iraqis over here to U.S. universities. So I was seeing your take on that, if that really gave back to good governance, and if we should be investing in that, if that's a thing the World Bank could invest in seriously, of getting the money there instantly and getting people over these programs educated, and then they're returning to rebuild their countries on firm values, and men and women combined. So seeing if, I know they did a little trial of that, but there hasn't been that much follow-up, and seeing if that's another trial thing they're willing to consider.
Call it a day.
First of all, thanks for your question about the follow-up on the London conference. Oxfam is one of the organizations we partner with, and it's a real partnership, so I really appreciate working with you guys. Unfortunately, a lot of the London conference, are statements of intent rather than real operational things that we can hold governments and organizations accountable to. Nothing has been said about decent work. Nothing has been said about what type of jobs the refugees will have. And what is often not also talked about is that these commitments is until 2018. So it's most probable that we're not going to see any of them soon. There's still very high negotiations to start with the governments of these countries, so let alone seeing this being implemented. Residency and work issues are really important, and this is where I think the international communities, the embassies, I know that, for example, the UK pledges will be followed up by the UK ambassadors in each of the countries, and in a lot of ways, the governments, the donor governments have a big role to play in making sure that these pledges are, followed through, and making sure that the number of working permits are for decent work, etc. So I would say really our job just started rather than, the second thing about work, which is very interesting, is these working permits might be a bit problematic. For example, in the context of Turkey, there's a very high nationalization of staff right now in local society organizations. Only 10% of each civil society organization should be non-Turkish, which of course is a huge barrier to Syrian organizations, because if 90% of the staff are from Turkey, with the language barrier, and that presents a problem. And in Lebanon, Lebanon, it's the same now. There is a very high wave of nationalization of staff. So this is something we need to really be mindful of. About psychosocial support is an integral part of most of our programs. I can speak for myself. For SAWA, I can also speak for a lot of international organizations who are doing amazing psychosocial support programs. We also recently started a partnership with Beirut, DC, called The Caravan, in which we are documenting stories of women, as part of a psychosocial support program. The Harmonic Education Program that I mentioned is another one. We're also working with women from host communities, bringing together Lebanese women and Syrian women in psychosocial support sessions, which is funny because in the first session, the Syrian women are like, why did you bring in Lebanese? And the Lebanese are, what are we doing here? But by the end of it, this is really an example of peace education without having to sit around the table and be like, peace, this is the definition, and this is the definition of democracy, and this and that. So there's a lot of very interesting programs. Definitely we should continue focusing more on psychosocial support. And thank you everyone for having me in DC. It's been great weather. So that's it, because I have to run to the airport
It's all
after
relative.
that. Yes. Well, I live in London, so yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of points. With the question about the Asian workers and how one can deal with this situation, it's actually quite clear that if these programs are developed to help the Syrian refugees, then any subsequent firms that establish presence in these zones should be targeting the Syrian refugees, as well as any Jordanian citizens, or if they're in Lebanon, Lebanese citizens. But on the other hand, we have to consider the fact that maybe these skills are not so highly available within the population, the targeted population. So then companies who want to employ Syrians will have to think about training them and also test the willingness of Syrian refugees to work in the specific fields where these companies operate. For example, apparel seems to be one area where we could gain presence. We could attract workers from Syria, but it is quite clear that Asian workers have sort of developed a specialty for that, and so it should be phased out. I think that when the contracts are over, employers could think about replacing these workers with workers from the Syrian population, and then they will gain knowledge about to what extent these skills are present and to what extent they have to do training. Regarding the protection of refugees, I think at this point the situation is quite dismal. Their children are working, there are abuses, people are working without contracts, and they're taken advantage of. So we are starting from the bottom, and I think what has to be done is implement measures that can introduce protection, but with having in mind that this protection shouldn't prevent the hiring of Syrian workers. Sometimes measures are so restrictive that employers would then, that these measures will then prevent employers from hiring Syrians. So it has to be the minimum, but it should ensure that these workers are treated with dignity, that they are treated equally to the citizens of these countries, so that there is no animosity created, because what Syria and what Lebanon and Jordan are, they are islands of safety, and they have been hugely welcoming. They have to remain islands of safety, and so we have to look at how we can extend help without creating tensions within the population. It has to be inclusive, so in that respect, we have to avoid implementing measures that create more barriers, because what the situation is right now is that there are many restrictions in the labor market in Jordan and to some extent in Lebanon, but in Jordan with many people queuing for public sector jobs, and then many people also working informally. So, but that applies to citizens too. So thinking about the citizens as well as the refugees.
Absolutely. Andrea.
So maybe I'll just pick up on the question that you had first. I actually didn't, the example that I gave earlier of our working with youth and putting them at with Syrian youth and putting them front and center and in sort of the market assessments, I only gave part of the picture. It's not just Syrian, but it's also Palestinian refugees. These There are 4 of these centers that we've set up for youth in Lebanon. They are safe spaces. It's another piece of this program that's incredibly important is the psychosocial piece. So it's giving them that the opportunity to heal, to engage with other people their age, and then to connect to the community through this the market assessment that they're doing, because many of them, I mean, when I was a teenager, I certainly didn't have any professional connections as well. So it's an opportunity for them to hone those skills. But this psychosocial piece is front and center, and it's Syrian and Palestinian refugees. In fact, just one more thing on the psychosocial, and my colleague who's sitting just to your left there, Carrie Diener, knows far more about this. I don't want to put her on the spot. I'll give the headline. If she wants to add to it, she can. But she just spent several days with one of our colleagues who has been leading some incredible work in Jordan, working with Syrian youth. And it's another piece to that is Yale University has been doing research on the changes that happen to young people's brains who have experienced tremendous trauma, and that you see the cortisol levels in their brain have actually dropped. And through the psychosocial work that we've been doing, which unfortunately is a very difficult model to continue because it's quite expensive, it's modeled along the lines of Outward Bound. So youth get an opportunity to go out and have experiences that are challenging them physically. They're bonding with one another, but we've seen through that work, the cortisol levels have actually increased, and their ability to make connections again with others and to, I think, feel less of the trauma that they've experienced has increased. I don't know, Carrie, do you have anything that you might want to add? Jane McPhail is the colleague of ours who's been pioneering this programming.
Well, just to add, I think a lot of you probably spoke with Jane when she was here, because I know we made the rounds with many of the folks in this room. But I think the big takeaway message from our psychosocial work is that we can no longer think of mental health programs as an add-on, and that they're actually very integral to programming and even to economic programming if people are going to move forward. And so we see them very much as life-saving and also as a big building block for any recovery plan for the region, because if you can't connect with yourself, with your community, with your family, there's no way that you can connect to the economic environment as well.
Thank you. And then just finally to this gentleman and your questions. For those of you who may not know, yes, it's correct, Mercy Corps had been working both from Damascus and doing cross-border very quietly from Turkey. And then we were given a choice by authorities in Damascus to either shut down our cross-border or leave Damascus, because we were reaching thousands of more Syrians through our cross-border work from Turkey. We made the very difficult decision to suspend our operations there. In terms of regrets, I think we did what we did because of the magnitude of the needs, and we felt we were able to reach more people, and so I think that we would stand by that decision. It's unbelievably difficult. I mean, there are so many organizations in this room today, especially, I would say, Mercy Corps' Syrian colleagues, who are risking their lives every day going across many, many conflict lines to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid. They are, it's heroic what they're doing, and I'm incredibly proud that I get to speak on behalf of the work that they're doing, and hopefully we'll be able to end the political crisis, end the war, which is getting to your second point about the root causes. So Mercy Corps has joined with Crisis Action, the International Medical Corps, many, many organizations, NGOs here in the United States and elsewhere, our Syrian colleagues, to try to get the UN Security Council resolutions that have been passed to actually be implemented. We must stop the war. That is the only way that we're going to be able to move forward into true recovery and to end the suffering of the Syrian people. And I would say we are a humanitarian organization. For that reason, we don't comment on matters of safe zones, and I hope you would respect our impartiality and independence. That moves us into an area that we're not comfortable in, but we want this war to end.
So thank you everyone for coming and for staying a little bit longer, because I think these are hard conversations to force into a 90-minute block or even an afternoon. We don't intend this to be a one-off. This is something that folks here at Aspen, at the Middle East Investment Initiative, and others are passionate about. We've got lots of friends, our friends at Crisis Action and elsewhere, Mercy Corps, who I think all of you, we would love to have further conversations on this. We're going to be talking with our colleagues here at Aspen, whether they be the Aspen Strategy Group, whether they be the Stevens Initiative, which is looking to foster and fund virtual exchanges, our international Aspen partners, whether they be Aspen Italia or Aspen France or Aspen Germany. They're doing convenings in Europe. The Middle East Investment Initiative, of course. We're wanting to build on this conversation going forward, and so please, consider yourselves friends of the family, and we would, look for your future emails, and please send us ideas on topics and ideas that we can play a role in convening. So thanks again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely.